Mary H. Gamble Professor of Religion at Occidental College. I'm coming to you today from the ancestral home and unceded land of the Tongva people, also known as Los Angeles. And I am delighted to serve as the moderator for today's event. I have long been a fan of Dr. Jonathan Zecher's work, and over the last few years, I've had the privilege of working alongside him as co-director of ReMeDHe, an international working group on the intersection of religion, medicine, disability, and health in late antiquity. It's clear that I'm not alone in my admiration for Jonathan, given the large crowd gathered here today to celebrate the publication of his new book, Spiritual Direction as a Medical Art in Early Christian Monasticism. For those of you who have not yet purchased the book, we're going to put a discount code in the chat. So now's the time to get that book or to have your libraries order a copy of the book for your institution. We are joined today by 4 esteemed scholars, each of whom will offer a 10 to 15 minute reflection on the book, followed by a few words by our author. Then we'll open up the space for conversation and questions from you all. As the panelists are speaking, please feel free to input your own comments and questions in the Q&A. These might be comments and questions related to the panelists' remarks, or they could be your own comments and questions. Any comments or questions are welcome. So please let me introduce our respondents and then we can get started. Our first respondent is Dr. Philip van der Eyck, who is the Alexander von Humboldt Professor of Classics and History of Science at Humboldt University. Dr. van der Eyck is one of the foremost scholars in the history of medicine, having led several research projects, including the Humboldt University Excellence Cluster, TOPOI, Knowledge Transfer in Antiquity. He is project director for the Berlin Brandenburg Academy's continuation of the Corpus Medicorum Graecorum, now titled Galen of Pergamum, the Transmission, Interpretation, and Completion of Ancient Medicine. He has published numerous monographs, articles, edited volumes and special issues, edited sections of Aristotle's Parva Naturalia, and with Bob Sharples, translated and annotated Nemesius of Amessa's On Human Nature in the Translated Texts for Historians series. If you are at this webinar, I'm sure you have read and come across and appreciated his work. Our second respondent is Dr. Andrew Crislip, the Blake Chair in the History of Christianity at Virginia Commonwealth University. Dr. Crislip's first book, titled From Monastery to Hospital, Christian Monasticism and the Transformation of Healthcare in Late Antiquity, was a groundbreaking study that investigated the importance of monastic healthcare in the history of institutional medicine, and more particularly in the development of the hospital. This book made a splash and immediately announced Dr. Crislip as a leading voice in the scholarship of healthcare in late antiquity. His next book, Thorns in the Flesh, Illness and Sanctity in Late Ancient Christianity, considered how health and illness figured into ancient depictions of sanctity, as well as how suffering provided a more direct knowledge of the self and of the divine. More recently, Dr. Crislip's work has shifted to emotions, emotional suffering, and pain. Again, anyone in the workshop should be quite familiar with Dr. Crislip's work. Our third respondent is Dr. Nikki Kasumi Clements, Walt and Lily Jackson Associate Professor of Religion at Rice University. Dr. Clements specializes in philosophy of religion and Christian asceticism in late antiquity, conceptualizing ethical formation through understanding of subjectivity as embodied, effective, and interrelational. Her first monograph, Sites of the Ascetic Self, John Cassian and Christian Ethical Formation, analyzes Cassian's ethics of daily practices. Dr. Clements' next 2 books are on Michel Foucault's fascination with these practices in early Christian texts, including Cassian's. Based on her own archival research at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, she also served as the volume editor for Mental Religion, the Brain, Cognition, and Culture, and she has authored articles on asceticism, religious ethics, hermeneutics, and the emotions, and I'm a big fan of her work. Last but not least, our final respondent is the esteemed Professor Wendy Mayer, retiring Dean of Research Strategy at University of Divinity, soon to be Emeritus Professors, and Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. The recipient of 6 Australian Research Council grants, Professor Mayer has just concluded a 3-year term as head of the ARC's religion section. She is known internationally for her research on early Christian preaching and the life and works of the Eastern Church Fathers, Father and preacher John Chrysostom. She's also become widely known for her work on the reception of Greek medicine in late ancient Christian thought, investigating Chrysostom's exploitation of medical concepts in his preaching, medical teaching within late antique Greek paideia, and the intersection between Greek medicine and Hellenistic moral philosophy. So as you can see, we have gathered 4 of our premier scholars in the field to comment on Professor Zecher's new book. So without further ado, I would like to pass it off to Dr. Vander Eyck to start us off.
Thanks very much, Kristi, for this kind introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this panel. And I'd like to start by congratulating Jonathan on the publication of this magnificent monograph. The main thesis of Jonathan's book is that early Christian authors such as John Cassian, Basil of Caesarea, and John Climacus, when writing on spiritual direction, made use of ideas and concepts derived from Greco-Roman medicine. The spiritual director's care for the members of his monastic community was modeled after the diagnostic and therapeutic attention given by the doctor to his patients, as described by Greek medical writers. And the superior's authority and his relationship with the members of his community was modeled not only on the doctor's technical competence and experience, but also on his moral integrity and self-control, which instilled trust and compliance on the part of his patients, thus ensuring greater therapeutic success. 2 chapters in this book are devoted to setting out this medical background, and it is those chapters which I will be primarily concerned with. The most prominent medical author Jonathan discusses is Galen of Pergamum, the prolific doctor and philosopher of the 2nd century CE, who was also court physician of the Roman emperors Marcus Aurelius and Commodus. Galen was enormously influential, and his voluminous works dominated medical teaching for many centuries to follow. They also had a strong impact on Christian ideas about health and disease. In general, with a few exceptions, one may say that the majority of Christian authors regarded the medical art as developed by Greek doctors such as Hippocrates and Galen as something God-given for the benefit of mankind. And hence they accepted most of Galen's teaching, although not uncritically, and we'll come to the criticism in a moment. We may say that by the late 4th century, Galen had become Christianized, just as Hippocrates and his famous oath had been adapted to Christian contexts. The fact that Galen believed in a creator God who was responsible for the nature of the universe and also for the microcosmos of the human body, and the fact that Galen regarded himself as a servant of divine healing, in his case Asclepius, made it relatively easy to adapt his ideas to a Christian setting. Now, Greek medical writers such as Galen were primarily concerned with the body and with bodily health and illness. To Christians, of course, the body was not unimportant. It was, after all, part of God's creation, but it was subordinated to spiritual health and growth. When it came to the soul, Greek medical writers also had important things to say on what we would call mental health. And this brings us closer to the theme of spiritual direction. Already long before Galen, Greek doctors and also philosophers discussed questions of the management and direction of psychological states and the correction of what they considered undesirable states of the mind, such as character flaws, morally bad dispositions, lack of self-control, proneness to damaging forms of emotional distress or excitement. In doing so, they often used medical language, speaking of vices and moral weaknesses in terms of diseases of the soul, and of their correction in terms of medical treatment by drugs or even surgery. Galen, too, wrote extensively about the errors and affections of the soul and their cure. And in his recently discovered work, Avoiding Distress, he describes how one can develop resilience to overcome critical situations of grave personal loss. Now, one might think that this medical language is just metaphorical, but this would be quite wrong. For in Greek medicine, there was no strict distinction between the mental and the physical. Greek doctors were aware of disturbances and disorders in the domains of cognition, emotion, and character. But they usually related these to underlying physical conditions, of which mental disorders were believed to be manifestations or symptoms. Conversely, they also described how mental states such as anger, envy, or anxiety could have a detrimental effect on the health of the body. We also find this pattern in philosophers such as Aristotle and the Stoics, both of whom thought of the soul and of all things mental in terms of embodiment. But even in Plato and Platonism, the strand of Greek philosophy that perhaps comes closest to Christian ideas, there was a strong belief that mental health and sanity was a matter of not just moral philosophy and good education, but also of physical treatment by means of diet, exercise, and even, if necessary, of medication and surgery. Their authority for this was Plato's Timaeus, which sets out a number of ideas on the management and, if necessary, the restoration of mental health by physical means. In the wake of this medico-philosophical tradition, Galen wrote a work defending the thesis that the capacities of the soul follow the mixtures of the body, which implies that one can enhance the state of one's soul by a healthy lifestyle, whereas a bad lifestyle may lead to corruption of the soul. Christians took this on board, though not uncritically. Thus, Nemesius, bishop of Emesa in the late 4th century, argued that the influence of the body on the soul should not be understood in a determinist sense. We are not slaves of our bodily mixture as long as we stay on top of it through self-control and through careful management of the body's mixture through diet and exercise. We have a responsibility ourselves here, and if we cannot manage on our own, we should call in the help of an expert. That is, a medical doctor or a spiritual counselor. The other chapter in Jonathan's book, which is relevant for my purposes today, is devoted to medical ethics, and especially the doctor-patient relationship. Greek medicine devoted much attention to the question of the doctor's moral integrity. One thinks here of the Hippocratic Oath, and there were various other writings dealing with medical etiquette and deontology. And this was not just because of the intrinsic value of morality in medical care, but also for the importance of trust between the doctor and the patient for the successful course of action. The doctor's reputation was of great significance here. For in the Greco-Roman world, there were no official bodies of accreditation certifying doctors' qualifications and allowing them to practice. There were no state regulations or professional bodies like the medical faculties of universities as we know them today. There was also intense competition between doctors in what has often been described as the medical marketplace. So the trust a patient could put in a doctor was based on the doctor's reputation, which in turn was based on past performance. Again, medicine provided a model for spiritual leadership and for the relationship between the superior and the members of religious communities. Now, for all the continuity between Greco-Roman and early Christian ideas here, there are also important points of difference, and one of these concerns the concept of good health. As Jonathan rightly claims, in Greek medical discourse about health, three ideas are very prominent. First, there is the concept of balance or symmetry, usually thought of in terms of a balance of elementary qualities, such as hot, cold, dry, and wet, or more generally, a balance of the powers, the dynames, present in the body. And this idea of the perfect balance or equilibrium was illustrated by the famous statue of the Canon of Polyclitus, the ideally proportioned human body. Connected with this was the idea of health as good functioning or good performance. Thus, Galen defines health as the good and unimpeded exercise of the natural functions of the body, such as growth, digestion, movement, sensation, feeling, etc. A third aspect of Galen's concept of health is the idea that health is relative, in Greek, pros ti. It's relative to the person involved, to the person's lifestyle, general habits, and habitat. Health admits of degrees which depend on the person and the circumstances in question. It is different for the young and the old, for men and women, for people living in warm countries and those living in colder regions, etc. This is what Jonathan calls the bio-psychosocial aspect of Greek medical thought. One could perhaps also consider calling it holistic. But a fundamental feature underlying all these ideas is the avoidance of extremes. And here we come to what I consider perhaps the most important difference between Greek medicine and early Christian ideas about health, the question about asceticism. Galen doesn't talk about religiously motivated asceticism, but he does speak very critically about another area where extreme bodily performance is aimed for, namely the practice of athletes, which he criticizes harshly as being extremely damaging to bodily health. Extrapolating from this, we might say that Galen would have been critical of some of the more extreme dietary practices in religious communities, such as excessive fasting or abstinence. And he would certainly also be very critical of the cultivation of disease as a divine calling or a sign of sanctity, as beautifully described by Andrew in his work on thorns in the flesh. Now, of course, more moderate positions were taken in Christianity as well, for example, by Basil the Great, discussed by Jonathan in one of the chapters. In Basil's monastic rule, moderation is a guiding principle, and there is careful consideration of human weakness. Yet, as Jonathan points out in his chapter on Basil, ultimately, the Christian spiritual leader is regarded as being superior to the physician, in that bodily health is put into the wider perspective and subordinated to spiritual values. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And next we will move on to Dr. Andrew Kussup.
All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to offer a few comments on Jonathan's new book. It's a book whose richness I've really only begun to explore, but I think it's going to set a new direction for conversations in the study of religion and healing in early Christianity. I was asked to focus on chapters 2 and 3, which address the diagnostic function of dreams in the spiritual writings of Evagrius of Pontus and John Cassian. I have to admit, I've always dreaded that moment when someone says, I had a really weird dream last night. All I think is, now you're going to tell me about it, aren't you? Yet I've always found ancient dreaming compelling. I'm probably not alone in being encouraged to think critically first about ancient dreaming by Michel Foucault's chapter on Artemidorus. The dream manual avoids that lengthy narrative and invites diagnosis and discernment, as much later psychoanalytical writers would, though quite differently. The dream worlds of ancient people are thus of continuing fascination, a window into the unconscious of people who didn't share in the introspective conscience of the modern world. And Jonathan's work on the biopsychosocial phenomena of dreams is especially fascinating in its rich sensory and physiological detail. Dreams, including bad dreams, were important for early Christians. Perhaps the earliest Christian sermon, the so-called Gospel of Truth, adduces dreams as analogy for the existential condition of humanity. To lack acquaintance with the true God, to live in groundless fear and disturbance and division is like a nightmare. Here's Bentley Layton's translation. The preacher is discussing what it's like to lack true gnosis, or acquaintance with the true God, the Father. It is as when one falls sound asleep and finds oneself in the midst of nightmares, running towards somewhere, powerless to get away while being pursued, in hand-to-hand combat, being beaten up, falling from a height, being blown upward by the air but without any wings. Sometimes, too, it seems like one is being murdered, though nobody is giving chase, or killing one's own neighbors whose blood one is smeared with. Until, having gone through all these dreams, one awakens. Those in the midst of all these troubles see nothing, for such things are nothing. Such are those who have cast off lack of gnosis from themselves like sleep, considering it to be nothing. Neither do they consider its other products to be real things. And as an aside, I only just now wonder if among those other products of dreams include the same products that John Cassian is so focused on in chapter 3. Rather, they put them away, like dreams in the night, and deem acquaintance with the Father to be the light. There are some differences in emphasis that may reflect the preacher's biopsychosocial context. For example, the preacher focuses more on interpersonal violence and juridical punishment, and less on the public humiliations that haunt the members of today's academic and professional managerial classes. Yet, these nightmares are striking to me just how familiar they are to our dream life today. But the preacher's understanding of the diagnostic power of dreams differs from the approaches of Evagrius and Cassian. At least in the context of this sermon, the contents of the dreams mean nothing, apart from revealing the illusory nature of the present world and human existence without true gnosis. They carry no further or specific diagnostic or diacritical salience for the moral state of the dreamer's psyche. This likely 2nd century sermon was transmitted and translated in Egypt at the same time as Evagrius directed souls there, in codices that spoke to persistent concerns about asceticism and the health of the soul. If we believe Irenaeus, this sermon was a revered text among the followers of the Alexandrian and Roman teacher and poet Valentinus. Valentinians such as Ptolemy of Rome and Theodotus of Alexandria might indeed have read this sermon in the context of a more diagnostic and diacritical spirituality. Ptolemy posited a world practically constituted by negative affect, literally demonic passions constituting the world and surrounding the Christian. Both Ptolemy and Theodotus, as Ismo Dunderberg has shown, presented their mode of Christian life as a therapeia for the soul, healing the disordered person of its pathe in the model of Christ's own redemptive progress. This was not an explicitly medical art, although Christians like Valentinus and Ptolemy were contemporaries of Galen in mid-2nd century Rome. They likely knew of him. I like to think of them passing one another uneasily with their retinues in the forum. It was a philosophical way of life, drawing on the same eclectic mix of Platonism and Stoicism that so influenced Evagrius. In Evagrius, a very different kind of Gnostic, we see a similar range of dreams, which Evagrius concisely summarizes. Through a number of telling passages in several treatises, Evagrius discusses dreaming as a biopsychosocial phenomenon, grounded in knowledge, in knowable and or mysterious bodily processes, conditioned by the nature and structure of the soul, and impacted by the context in which the dreamer lives. His fellow ascetics, family and friends left behind, his ecological environment, and most especially his most numerous fellow sojourners in the desert, demons. While earlier scholarship has emphasized the Stoic background for Evagrius's approach to dreams and their entanglements with wicked or maladaptive trains of thought, Zecher points to the influence of Aristotelian natural science and Galenic medicine of Galen himself and/or his later imitators for Evagrius's conceptualizations of body and soul. Evagrius's own interest in the diagnostic value of dreams and significance of bodily processes and disease for spiritual direction encouraged me to look anew at Palladius's biographical writing about his teacher. I think the two most important turning points in Evagrius's life are first, his vivid juridical nightmare in Constantinople, which spurred him to pack up all his fancy clothes and immediately flee his romantic entanglements for the safer ascetic environs of Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, then, it is his bodily humors and Crassus that speaks spiritual truths. Fever and to attempted treatment. But the Blessed Melania discerned that the underlying case was thoughts. And once he confessed them, he was healed. While it is so often that the emphases of the Egyptian lives overlap so minimally with the works transmitted under the saint's own byline, for example, Antony, Pachomius, and Shenouda, it's nice to see a concordance in the biographical tradition with Evagrius's own literary corpus. More skeptically, these could just be the sorts of stories that one might tell to put a saint's idiosyncratic teachings about demons, thoughts, and humoral mixtures in a richer biopsychosocial context. A great value in Jonathan's approach is the thorough incorporation of Platonic and Aristotelian psychology filtered through Galen's reception, that is, the structure of the psyche as a component of the body, albeit a sort of organ of a very fine material. Evagrius's 8 wicked thoughts are arrayed against the components of the tripartite soul, and it is crucial that the monk and spiritual director be able to discern the interaction of demonic thinking and psychic passion distributed in these 3 parts, themselves distributed in 3 bodily organs. I have benefited from others who have emphasized Evagrius's integration of Platonic and Aristotelian psychology into his monastic psychagogy, including helpful tables and charts like those that Jonathan has included in this volume. I think the focus here on the medical techne of spiritual direction, on the physiological conceptualizations of dreaming and thinking, demonic and otherwise, moves the conversation forward considerably. I admit that I have tended to see the tripartite soul as an interesting and influential piece of intellectual history. Isn't it curious that the ancients, or at least some select group of them, of educated and acculturated ancients, held on to this very curious way of thinking, so different from our own? Some years back, I read Daniel Gross's short book, The Secret History of Emotions, From Aristotle's Rhetoric to Modern Brain Science. He begins, "If you are tickled to learn that the Aztecs located passions in the liver, here is something at least as quaint from René Descartes. The ultimate and most proximal cause of the passions of the soul is none other than the agitation with which the spirits move the little gland which is in the middle of the brain, that is to say, the pineal gland." The way Gross phrases these observations, tickled and quaint, comes off as a bit condescending, but the comparison points to something important. Whether we are thinking of the passions of the Aztec liver, the Cartesian pineal gland, or the Platonic tripartite soul, which Gross doesn't really address. This is one of the important points that comes from Jonathan's medical and physiological reading of Evagrius's tripartite classification of dream imagery and John Cassian's near obsession with the origins of nocturnal emissions. The tripartite soul, so central to monastic anthropology, is not a mere concept, nor an antiquarian oddity to be tickled by or find quaint. We can imagine that this tripartite soul, which mediates external stimuli of passions and trains of thought with internal processes, including the medical phenomenon of Crassus, mixture of bodily humor, could have a defining impact on the way ascetics like Evagrius and Cassian, for example, experienced their bodies, not merely how they thought about them. Our brain conceptualizes and indeed predicts our bodily processes through interoception. That is, the brain's representation of sensations from your body's organs, tissues, hormones, and immune system, as Lisa Feldman Barrett succinctly describes it. But our brain, trapped in a very thick and very dark skull, has very limited access to our bodily processes. Perhaps like Evagrius's demons lack access to the interiority of our souls. And so based on noisy and ambiguous signals, again, Barrett, the brain less interprets bodily processes than it predicts them, and in a sense constructs them. Such predictions are crucial to the experience of passions and pains and rely on biopsychosocial context, not least on concepts such as there are 8 types of wicked thinking that afflict 3 parts of the soul located in 3 bodily organs, or there are between 6 and 8 basic emotions evolutionarily conditioned biopsychological faculties or circuits demonstrated by universally shared facial expressions which can be triggered involuntarily by external stimuli. These 2 ways of taxonomizing passion and mapping them onto mind-body processes have comparable basis in scientific literature, but construct different, very different experiences of being human in a biopsychosocial context, ways of being that are historically contingent. I'm interested especially in the intersections of Jonathan's approach to potential innovations in the history of experience. Rob Bottas and Mark West recently published a Cambridge Elements volume laying out a case and possible methods for the history of the senses and the history of the emotions combined, prefigured in a null school historiography, to be joined in dialogue in the historicization of experience itself, also informed by neuroscience, but not reduced by it. Jonathan's chapters on dreaming are as mediated by concepts of bodily process, psychological structure, and emotional taxonomy inspired me to begin thinking more about how passions and senses together may form a type of experience open to historical inquiry in health and religion in late antiquity. And with that, I will yield the rest of my time to the chair.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kristi. And next, we are moving on to Dr. Kasumi Clemens.
All right, thank you so much. Let's see. All right, it's a modified share screen. I'm going to keep my notes a little bit more conversational in the interest of trying to expand to 2 audiences that Jonathan does not explicitly engage with in this text, and yet that I think really need to learn from his brilliance. While Jonathan Zecher is giving us just a feast of gorgeous readings for both the scholars of late ancient Christian monasticism, as well as, I think, although he protests, the scholars of ancient medicine, there are 2 modern audiences that I think are also going to be taken up by this different world, by this different place, yet that share these questions that have an urgency, both to late antiquity as well as today. At the base, we have these 2 questions. What is the human person? How do we understand the relationship between physiology and psychology? How do we understand our co-imbrication? How do we not even language the words dualism? How do we not even bring into the conversation the kind of specters that have haunted modern philosophy? This is the brilliance of the conversation here. This is the brilliance that the panelists that I've learned from for so long have all brought. And this is the brilliance that Jonathan brings to this book. It's to not even invoke the modern as the problem that needs to be corrected, and to instead bring us into a different imaginative landscape, to bring us into a world where we don't have to combat the Cartesian ghost, but instead can take up the practices, take up the questions of what it is to be human and the question of how to live. Here, in relation to the question of spiritual direction as an art, as a technique. And spiritual direction as a technique that both brings together the relation of the advisor and advisee, the doctor and the penitent, but it also opens up a relation of the monk to themselves. There's this way of thinking about descritio, about direction, about the healing arts, as not just about discrete illness, but as instead an opening into how we might think about what it is to live, how it is to be, and what it is to think about what counts as good health and well-being, while recognizing the struggles of every day. Now, to this end, the two audiences that I've been invoking are, on the one hand, students today, medical humanities students. Why should they take up this work? What is it that's of fascinating interest here? What have I seen in my own classrooms by students who have taken up these ancient texts and have come to life? These are students who are being trained within medical fields, who so often say, I wanted to become a doctor because I wanted to take care of people, but there are no people in my texts. Where are the humans? Where's their own understanding of self? Where's their own understanding of who I might be too, as a healer, as a doctor, as a professional? And it raises that specter of trust that Philip brought up earlier. That question of trust, how is it that we come to think about this relation of direction, this relation of care, this relation of what it is to lead a life in relation to others that isn't about domination and violence, that isn't about the kind of Foucauldian negation that we might ascribe to a certain reading of power, but is instead thinking about relationality in a much more intimate way. Now, two, the second audience that I think really needs to read this work is that of the Foucauldians. Bizarrely enough, because Foucault is in the background of this text and yet not continuously invoked. The reason why Foucault ends up so invested in these late ancient figures is because he's trying to figure out this modern problem, this modern obsession with why is it that we're obliged to tell the truth about ourselves? Which truth is that? And of course, he there is thinking about 19th century psychiatrists like Dr. ReMeDHe, who are exacting out through water torture the truth about patient A, the truth about their madness, the truth about who they are, notably as sexual beings. Foucault traces these questions back in history, and he expects the early modern confessors to be able to give him an answer to why we're compelled to confess in this way, why we're compelled to confess our sexual desires as the secret source of who we are, the concupiscencia as the source of ourselves, subjectivity being measured vis-a-vis sexuality. This is what Foucault expects to find. And yet, as he goes back to Cassian, as he goes back to Augustine, to Nyssa, to Clement, to Tertullian, he finds something very different. He finds instead this art of living. He finds instead an opening, not a closure, as he thinks through these relations of care. And so for the Foucauldians, the relationship of spiritual direction that Foucault is trying to think through in antiquity, especially with Greeks, if you think about a Socrates and Alcibiades, if you think about the ways in which the Parrhesiast relationship of Diogenes to Alexander evokes a different kind of relationship, a reversible relationship of power. So too does the way within which spiritual direction in antiquity open up a new sense for Foucault about what we can think about in these relations of power. No longer just the confessor and the confessee, no longer the psychiatric authority exacting out water-tortured confessions from patient A, no longer the truth of Michel Foucault as a gay man needing to confess the truth of who he is in order to be reformed. Instead, there's a way in which an ethos of living, instead a way in which the care for oneself and for the other, the way within which the cura sui is both the care of oneself as well as the cure of or for oneself. These are the kinds of questions that open up for Foucault within these ancient texts. And I wish that he had read Jonathan Zecher's work, because not only are there ways within which Foucault himself is kind of getting an ethos resonant within these materials, but I feel like the very starting point that Jonathan brings us to is one that would have corrected so many of the more egregious readings that I see of Foucault, notably on Cassian. Now, why do I go into this excursus of Foucault? Well, in part because that's my world, but in part because there are these theoretical stakes at play. And usually the way that we come to these conversations is to take up a modern problem, to trace it back, and to see alternatives. Jonathan refuses to do that and instead puts us in the middle of action. He puts us in the middle of a world, and he puts us in the middle of the granularity of daily experience in ways that Cassian himself does, and that I think John Climacus is bringing up as well. So the two actual chapters I'm supposed to address are chapters, let's see, is it 4 and 5 technically? And these are the two questions that come up after the dream interpretation. So this is not the sexiness of the Onirocritica, nor of nocturnal illusions, but instead the taxonomies of the vices. Jonathan's book is brilliant in so many ways, including in the ways in which he captures that world, but it's also very practical. He brings us lists, he brings us descriptions, he brings us jokes. In his footnotes, he brings things to life. You're also wondering if he's making dirty jokes in places where it's just subtle enough to be under the radar. So too do I think Cassian engages such titillating and yet humanizing questions, such as those of the 8 principal vitia. Now, as Andrew is referring to in relation to Evagrius and Cassian, the continuities between this chapter on Cassian brings us also to his taken up by the figure of Jonathan Climacus. And so we move from the 4th century to the 5th century to the 7th century with these currents between. Cassian provides this fulcrum then between the Evagrian figures in the desert and the Climacan uptake within Byzantine traditions. He also, notably, brings us to this world that we'll know best in the West through the 7 deadly sins. Now, of course, anyone here knows that the 7 deadly sins are instead these logismoi of Evagrius. They're the 8 principal vitia that Cassian is describing within his texts, and that you can see within this table number 4.1. Jonathan, in his chapter, is outlining the way that Cassian effectively gives us this nosology, right? He gives us this description of what the different diagnoses are. And this is not just in order to take care of a particular discrete illness. This is not about the simply curative function. Instead, this is a question of what is it that all humans struggle with? How is it that we have these origins for these sources of stress and struggle? How is it that we can come to understand those origins as causes? How can we understand their cures? How do we understand the very therapies that we also can take up? Within this chapter, then, Cassian, is describing the basic 8. You have gluttony, or from the Evagrius, gastromagia. You have fornicatio, of course, which Foucault obsesses about. You have avaritia, avarice. You have anger, as ira, sadness, tristitia, akadia, a personal favorite. Vainglory, as kenodoxia, and pride, superbia. Now, Jonathan gives us a brilliant account of the way within which, for Cassian, these are not only particular vices that exist somewhere in the metaphorical materialisms of vitia and spirits, demons, passions, as well as what we might understand today as emotions. There's an undercurrent between these. There's an ecosystem of agencies. There is no separation that makes the passions or the emotions rigidly separate from the demons and the vices. Instead, the very coherence of these materialities and agencies is a part of the struggle in the monastic professio. The origins, causes, and cures of these 8 principal vices is the very task that Cassian takes up, both in his institutes, in the preface. This is the very way of life. This is exactly what the monastic life is about. And then in the conferences, he elaborates theoretically on what are the implications for this. How is it that one can take up these 8 principal vices, understanding them not as pathological, but as instead inviting opportunities for us to come to more integrated, more healing, more humane in some ways of life. The intersection between these 8 principal vices is really fascinating to me. It's much more like the Scarface. First you get the money and then the power, the women. Here, the connections between gluttony is giving rise to fornication, giving rise to avarice. And if you lust after your neighbor, then of course you're going to be anger. After that anger and the heat comes the sadness. After the sadness comes the kind of torpor and akadia. And yet, if you've already gone through this process, there's also the specter of progress. If you're a monastic who has achieved akadia, this is also a sign that you have advanced within the monastic life. Now, because you've advanced in the monastic life, there's the threat that vainglory or kenodoxia lurks. If you think that you have all the outward appearances of the really good monastic and yet do not have the integration with the internal disposition, you yourself are exalting a certain practice and the way in which others see you at the expense of an integrated disposition. Let's say that you're able to actually take care of this disposition, forge the affectus, then what threatens is pride, the idea that you are the source of your own excellence and agency. And that, of course, is the sin of the fallen angel. So as Jonathan continues it in this chapter, he elaborates the ways within which Cassian's own nosology not only allows us to identify what these problems are, but to take up very specific therapeutics. And he does this in a way that brings us back to the tripartite soul in a way that Andrew was raising a second ago. And this time, the way that Jonathan's presenting the tripartite soul, as well as the very Stoic understanding, as opposed to strictly Evagrius or Platonic notions, it illuminated something for me that I would like to put as a question to Jonathan as well. This is the question of the relationship between conception of medicine as organ or organic, as I finally put together today for some reason, organ-based versus humorally based. And of course, for Galen, it's both. But the question then of why does Cassian both identify these different faculties, these different organs? And what does it say about the way within which a disposition, when it's forged, requires an integration between the attentions of these different parts of the soul, as well as the different movements of the organs? There's this broader question that kept coming to mind for me, which is how is the disposition, the adfectus, the very way of life that I think that Cassian and Jonathan are both highlighting so much? How is this a question of a spiritual direction as a medical art that is preventative more than it is curative? Is there even a room for a palliative dimension? And so when we're thinking about the affectus as opposed to a particular crisis, as opposed to a particular illness, what is it that we might think through in relation to the disposition and how Cassian himself is innovated within? The questions that the Climacus chapter raises become even more fascinating for me in political and social dimensions that I hope that Jonathan, you might also be willing to talk about, where you describe so compellingly how Climacus takes up the pathos, no longer as a singular instance of the movement of soul and body, but instead as reserved for this dispositional state, for a cipher for who one is. Now, as the pathos becomes the co-permanence in some ways with the dispositional state, right, as an ongoing disposition, it also becomes pathologized. And I feel like there's something that's really important about the co-imbrication between those two things, where the pathologization of passions is married to this reduction of the pathos from the affectus to the adfectus. And I think within the broader questions that you raise within Climacus, the readings that Foucault has of Cassian, for example, the pathologizing readings, the critique of hierarchy, these come up so powerfully within Climacus. And I wonder, what is it that you see as socially and politically different? What is it that you see kind of evokes a different kind of life world, especially when it comes to thinking about spiritual direction as a medical art in a very different kind of political and social regime? So to conclude, I'll just bring us back to the three main contributions that I think that you're making, both to contemporary medical humanities, as well as to scholars of Foucault, scholars of philosophy of religion, scholars who are interested in questions of what it is to be human and how to live in a world of suffering. I think these are deeply resonant today. The first contribution is that you started from the middle of a philosophical anthropology that is constitutively non-dualist. You use the language of the biopsychosocial model. I think this is very productive. But I think that it's also a sleight of hand because you already show us through your figures and worlds and practices a world that doesn't need a fancy title in order to show us the co-imbrication of the biological, the psycho, the social. If we take the co-imbrication of the biological, the psychological, and social seriously, then spiritual direction as a medical art is necessarily an integrated practice. It's one that takes into account both the particulars of one's physiology, of one's psychology, as well as the broader ecosystem within which one is situated. And within this question then of what is it that Jonathan brings to life? How is this a very different model of not only medicine and spiritual direction, but of health and illness? How can we come to speak to medical students today, to theorists today, to people just trying to get through today? What is it that we might think about in terms of a preventative versus a curative versus a palliative form of care? And to what extent do you see these ancient figures as helping us think through new paradigms for what it is to be human, but even more importantly, new paradigms for relating to oneself and relating to the other?
Thank you so much, Dr. Kasumi Clements. And our last panelist is Dr. Wendy Meyer.
Thank you. And thank you, Jonathan, for asking me to respond to chapters 7 to 9 of this book, which are framed as, so in many ways, they're a mirror to chapters 3 to 5. And in this case, taking you from the 4th to 7th century, not through the lens of Evagrius, Cassian, and John Climacus, but through the lens of Basil of Caesarea, Cassian, and John Climacus. But before I talk about these chapters and the questions that they bounced off in my mind, I want to just say that I want to celebrate this book for adding weight to approaches to late ancient Christian theology, not as appropriating medical metaphor purely as analogy, but as using medical metaphor precisely because these texts present practices and therapeutic models that are a species of medicine. So these are texts that are produced by authors who view the expert role of the spiritual director, which is the focus of these chapters, as Jonathan demonstrates, in direct continuation with earlier physicians, albeit focused on the production and maintenance of ascetic health. So one of the highlights of chapters 7 to 9 is how the eliciting of a reinterpretation of traditional elite male culture and values is woven throughout the analysis of the 3 different approaches to the spiritual director as expert practitioner, exemplified within these chapters. And one of the other things I want to celebrate is the lyricism of John's language. As Nikki explained, there's almost jokes and things that you just suddenly go like, oh my, this is just fantastic writing. And I'm just going to quote a few things that just delight as you read the book. So in chapter 7, we get on page 240, so far Galenic. However, Basil's deployment of Christ's exemplary obedience greatly expands the range of activities that might count as luxuries, and so shifts the location of a health equipoise. Or in chapter 8, Cassian's elders are inevitably patient, gentle, or at least that's the idea. In reality, spiritual directors, like physicians, frequently fall short of the ideal. So what happens when it all goes wrong? And again, in that same chapter, so far so good, we have a fervent monk doing the right thing for the right reasons. And you know you're about to hear what happens when they don't do the right things for the right reasons. Or in both the institutes and conferences, the lives of the elders are the mold, and they're teaching the material of monastic formation. They are the trackers who cut the trail to the kingdom of heaven through the heart's landscape. So these chapters, and in fact the whole book, just has this beautiful lyricism of language throughout it that takes these very complex ideas and leads you through them to these really quite stunning insights in many ways. So the themes of all 3 chapters, and I'm not going to tell you exactly what is going on in these 3 chapters because I think you should actually go read them yourself. So the themes in all 3 chapters are about authority and coercion, obedience and willingness, and the clinical role of confession in the calibration of therapy. That's what I pretty much took away from these chapters. And it's things like what happens when you have a good therapist as model, or spiritual director or supervisor, what happens when they're not so good, as happens in the case of what Cassian discusses and John Climacus, and also what happens when the patient is not responsive. And a lot of the earlier material that is brought in about patient abandonment, medical responses to patients, gets teased out in particular in these 3 chapters. I particularly like things like, as he talks about how you avoid styling yourself as someone who abandons patients, is in the issue of what happens when you have intransigent monks who are not susceptible to healing. So in these different models, and one of the things he shows in these chapters is how you get all sorts of variations. So there's no monolithic, homogeneous approach here, but a whole range of subtle variations in models that are being held up as expert practitioners. So in both Cassian and Basil, while this might result in effectively a concept of the intransigent practitioner or monk as contaminating or a part of contagion, so in that disease model, when you get to John Climacus, there's this peculiar idea of them as psora or irritation. So it's a completely different conceptual framing of what happens so completely different medical understanding of and how you respond to a monk who is being intransigent and not responding. So I'm not praising this book for the sake of praising it, but because in my view, it represents a mature analysis and application of insights that started to emerge in late antique scholarship more than a decade ago, inspired in turn by the insights about the holistic entwinement of philosophy and medicine in relation to the soul that developed in classical Greece and transferred into Roman medical and philosophical thought, as argued by our first speaker, Philip van der Eyck, as he set this out in the 1990s. This book, I think, disrupts the traditional view of the superior monk relationship as one of discipling, focused largely on the spiritual life of the monk, and takes our understanding of that process to a whole new level. And I want to say that metaphors really matter. Anyone who's engaged with conceptual metaphor theory and cognition and its applications knows that metaphorical framing, when publicly communicated, has real-world behavioral consequences. And I think what Jonathan has done in the whole book, but particularly in these last 3 chapters, is show that this is not just the spiritual director or superior as physician, but really they are physician. And this has implications for what happens. And I'm going to tease out some of those now. So one of them is, John talks in chapter 8 about Cassian's, the chilling implications of Cassian's medical metaphor in regards to patient abandonment. And he relates this specifically to the monastic model, but I want to ask what happens when this is applied more broadly. And we see this in other late ancient writings, and it's emerged in my own work where I've analyzed John Chrysostom in relation to anti-Semitic tropes. So if you apply this model to your patients, who are all your listeners in preaching, and not just in the monastic setting, then you get what Courtney Van Vella has brought out, which is the implication that Jews as unwilling participants, remember willingness to be obedient, to learn through confession, etc., is part of what is brought out in these chapters. You end up with this idea that the Jews historically and in the contemporary late ancient world, and perhaps today, are these unwilling patients who need to be amputated because they can never be healed. I think that's actually quite a worrying implication of what happens as you theologize these ideas. And perhaps more directly relevant and more troubling is the implication of the combination of confession, penitence, and the idea of obedience and willingness in relation to LGBTQ people who are subjected in certain evangelical forms of Christianity today to conversion therapy. It seems to me that the medical model is directly at play in the way that the subject and healer are positioned within this framework. So is this, I want to ask, a version or variation of the spiritual director as medical expert modeled by Cassian and John Climacus in particular? And as someone who's the director of research strategy, and anyone who works in the Australian context knows, research translation matters to our government. It's not just about, these are great ideas, pure knowledge is fantastic for the sake of pure knowledge, but you've always got to explain what's the value to the Australian taxpayer. And I think this is where Nikki's questions around, who are the audiences comes into play as well. So what are the implications and applications of Jonathan's insights for contemporary spiritual direction and the training of spiritual directors? So I'm in a university where we actually have courses in spiritual direction, where you have students who are both there because they want to learn as a practitioner and people are training to be spiritual directors. So the focus in the book is on residential formation in enclosed communities. So as religious orders decline significantly around the world and spiritual direction is transforming into something different in its application, I want to ask what the applications are here. The relationship between spiritual director and practitioner essentially remains the same, I think, but the director is usually now working with practitioners or mentees who are embedded in the world with a much higher level of affectual bombardment and encounters. So directors may still work with them one-on-one, but they may also be working with a group, so something like a yoga class, or with mentees who come to a monastery or retreat center for short programs, intensives. These are not people who are investing their entire life in their health and training. They want to be healthy, but they're not willing to commit their entire life to developing that healthy program. So in this sense, I think the form of asceticism that we see today is very much like that which John Chrysostom himself encountered in Syria. You come for the day, you bond with other trainees, and you go home at night. And that he works to inculcate as a spiritual director in the domestic household, with the paterfamilias as the head of the domestic little monastery. I am simply throwing these challenges out here, but would love to hear from Jonathan how he thinks the insights that he brings out in his book apply in these contemporary settings. How do they apply to the training of today's spiritual directors, or don't they? And do you think there is a contemporary application that is implied by your deliberate choice of spiritual direction as a translation for the classical term psychagogy? And I want to say that one might think here that a starting point is in the upward mobility that Jonathan describes in the maturation from practitioner to director. And what implications do your findings have for the shift in contemporary medicine towards the treatment of chronic disease, both physical and psychological, through lifestyle therapy? These are my questions. I'm going to stop them here and allow Jonathan to speak now.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Mayer. So now we have time to hear from our esteemed author, Dr. Jonathan Zecher. So as he is responding to our panelists, the rest of you are welcome to input your own questions and comments in the Q&A. So take it away, Dr. Zecher.
Well, thank you very much. I'm so used to going by people's first names. I hope that won't be a problem. So thank you, Kristi, and then thank you also very much, Philip, Andrew, Nikki, Wendy. One reason I asked each of you to comment on the book, not only so that I could kind of use your reflected glory for myself, although that's always important, but also because each of you, your work has at one point or another been formative for my own way of reading either ancient medical, philosophical, or kind of broadly early Christian material. So it's nice to have people that I think of as in one way or another my mentors to interact with. So thank you all very, very much. I'll go briefly to respond just a little bit and maybe leave some of these questions as questions, because I think they should be treated as questions to be held close and not just to be answered right now. I don't think we need to stop that conversation. So to start with, Philip, your response, I think the point you raise about Galen's mistrust of extreme versions of health, his dislike of the athletes in that wonderful treatise, the Thrasybulus, and elsewhere, but especially there when he mocks them for their frankly false version of health. I think he would be at the very least startled and probably deeply mistrustful, if not outright disdainful, of the version of health that is sought after in Christian asceticism. because it is a kind of athletic health, a kind of extreme formation, as opposed to a moderate balance. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't invoke ideas of balance. They do, but that they do so for an end which is maybe not recognizable as healthy to someone like Galen. And so I think it is important, as for people like me, especially, who want to see continuity and influence from medicine into Christian practices, to also see where those points of discontinuity are. And I suspect that's exactly one, because it's not just, oh, I don't like this kind of asceticism, but the very mentality, the very impulse to an ascetic formation is a kind of impulse to an extreme form of health, or a privileging of extremes. And that might be a very deep discontinuity. So I think that's very helpful. Andrew, well, for one thing, I'd never really read the Gospel of Truth, I'm embarrassed to say, but I'm going to now. That is phenomenal. This description of the waking life of the unknowing as a kind of living nightmare is fantastic. For me, it reminds me of a moment, just a passing reference, in Clement of Alexandria, who compares the life of this world to a dream from which we wake. And thinking of Evagrius's known reliance on Clement, if there is more cross-fertilization or interest in these other texts that have at various points been thought of as, out of the mainstream or of different communities, but of course are contained in the Nag Hammadi codices, which were in all probability being read and copied by Pacomian monks. So the monastic context is quite strong for these other texts as well. And I want to think more about those relationships. Likewise, I think Evagrius's biography, thinking of it in terms first of his dream, which reminds me of that moment when Galen says his father was commanded by a very vivid dream to change his son's career from one thing to medicine, basically. You have this moment where the dream is taken with profound seriousness. And I think you do see that in Evagrius's work, that you take dreams very seriously. They may not tell you what you should do, but they can certainly tell you a lot about yourself. And likewise, I'm very excited to think more about the realities of embodied emotion in authors like Evagrius, Cassian, Climacus, the way in which their discussion of the soul is very much a way of describing their embodied experience. And when they locate passions or certain kinds of cognition in certain organs, or align them with certain organs, brain, heart, and liver, that they're not just having a convenient schema to work with, they're actually describing the physical sensations, those things we often call affect, and relating them to their cognitive experience in ways that I think do resonate profoundly, especially with people like Lisa Feldman Barrett's work, or Antonio Damasio's work on a profoundly embodied sense of emotion and cognition, as the brain tries to see the world through its own reception of stimuli and impulses from within the body. And I want to keep thinking about that a lot more, actually. Nikki, you raise all sorts of good questions. You are quite right that there were many dirty jokes embedded in the text of this. That was not an accident. When you're writing about wet dreams, it seems like the thing to do, at least when you're me and you're basically a 14-year-old boy in a 41-year-old man's body. The other thing is that the lists are there as a way, I think, of understanding not just how people exert control, although lists are often treated that way, as a ways of exerting control or dominating one's own life, or one's relationship to oneself or others, but also as a way of opening up possibilities, that the lists are often open-ended. How many passions are there? Well, there may be 8, there may be 26. These are ways of organizing and trying to describe that profoundly embodied experience that Andrew, you pointed to. And I think this, you've seen the same thing. Now, one thing you raise is a very interesting question: the difference between conceptions of medicine as organic or humoral. And is there maybe a tension in there in the development of an integrated disposition that is attending to the function, operation, and indeed possibly balance within particular organs? There may be a tension, there may be just a layered sense of harmonization that what happens at one level needs to happen at a larger level, needs to happen at the level of the whole human being. This is likewise a way of integrating body and soul capacities and so on. But it does lead to different ideas of how medical therapy intervenes on, say, emotional dysfunction or other ways in which the human being can go wrong, I guess. And you raised the question between the difference, I'm sorry, between preventative or curative or even palliative care. And I think that's really interesting. And I think this is raised again also by Wendy. You know, these models of medicine. Are we intervening on already sick bodies? Are we preventing sickness? Or are we looking at ways of cultivating greater and greater degrees of health, kind of qualitatively improved health, without worrying that someone is really, really sick or injured? And I think all of those can be in play. But one thing that's really highlighted in late antique medicine and in spiritual direction is the sense of palliative, or what you might think of as hygienic care. That it's about qualitative improvement of what is already maybe a basically healthy person, but they need to get healthier. And so you have smaller interventions of diet and regime that allow them either to recover from a more severe illness, and in that sense, kind of a recovery, or you allow them the possibility of simply improving from a decent state of health to a greater state of health and cultivating something more. And I think a lot of what we see in spiritual direction is engaging that model. And I think that is useful for thinking about how we understand healthcare and healthcare delivery today, because so much of the biomedical model is built around intervening on someone who is already sick. You don't go to the physician when you're feeling well, you go when you're sick. And then you get your pills, or you get your drugs, you get your surgery, you get your whatever to restore you to where you don't have to go see the physician. Whereas a model of hygiene says that the reason you go to your physician is the same reason you go to a nutritionist or a yoga instructor or any number of other, frankly, healthcare practitioners in a wider ecosystem of healthcare that allow you to improve your health without having to get really sick or injured first. And so I think what we see in spiritual direction is an embracing of a model that is quite useful in modern healthcare, and is, I mean, both for patients' health and also economically, because frankly, it's cheaper to help people stay healthy than to treat them when they get really sick. But there's actually one other dimension that I'd want to raise, which is that if one takes spiritual direction seriously as a species of medical art, then one has to embrace not just the biopsychosocial, but the spiritual. And another dimension of many, many, many people's lives that is too often ignored, even in medical humanities. That we look for creativity, we look for personal narrative, we look for all kinds of things, but faith commitments, spiritual commitments, religious identity, belonging to a community, these are often ignored, and spiritual direction engages exactly that component that I think is so crucial to the future of medical care, and especially medical humanities as intervening in medical care. And so this, in some ways, I think also responds to your points, Wendy. I'd like also to address the first two questions you raised: patient abandonment as a model, the chilling implications when you get outside the monastery. I mean, frankly, it's bad enough in the monastery. Kicking someone out is not a small thing to do. You've now left them homeless and wandering. You've made them a pariah. You've made their lives extraordinarily difficult and problematic. And if they weren't curable before, they sure as heck aren't going to be now. So even within the monastery, I think the implications can be really, horrifying. If you extend it to the larger community, yes, I think you probably do create damned groups. You probably do create out groups who are considered so incurable that they are disposable. And that is problematic. So there has to be a way of understanding this, that if this is to be reclaimed, there has to be a way of understanding spiritual direction that doesn't necessarily lead to that. And then the question is, how does one build a model of spiritual direction which takes seriously the need for change in individuals' lives and the need for the health of a community, but without creating damned individuals and groups? Likewise, is conversion therapy, in big scare quotes, a version of this? Well, yeah, I mean, it is. It's a particularly, again, horrifying, nasty, scientifically unsound, morally reprehensible version of this, but it is. And that again points to the need for critical self-reflection, that one doesn't go, oh, well, here's spiritual direction, it's medical art, check, all done, let's just do it. No, we have to be thinking about what this implies for people who are submit to it, for people who direct. And I think that is where the big questions come, because these models of spiritual direction can be quite useful, I think, if put into relation with psychiatric practices, with other medical practices, but only if done so in a spirit of humility, critical self-reflection, and generosity. And that's what I hope I find in these monastic authors. I certainly think I do. I think that's how they operate as well, despite some of their harsher statements. I think they are committed to the spirit of humility and love, without which none of this would be possible, but is also, I think, to some extent, the necessary ingredient if it's to be in any way useful today. So that's probably more than my 5 minutes, but I thank you all very, very much. And Kristi, I'll hand it back to you if there are some questions or people want to discuss.
Great, thank you so much, Jonathan. So again, let me remind you, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. So we will start with a question, Jonathan, asking what role the word, logos or rhema, plays in spiritual direction, and in what way has the speaking word, in which way does the speaking word have a therapeutic character in spiritual direction?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it comes from the relentless emphasis in desert literature on, give me a word. Or a brother came to an old man seeking a word that he might be saved. What is the word? And there is an emphasis on advice as therapy. That the word given is not a physical intervention, but it is an alteration to a way of thinking, to a way of self-perception, what Nikki raised, the relationship to oneself, that very often the word given invites the recipient to see themselves and the world in a new light. And in that sense, it offers the possibility of changing their habits, and with their habits, their disposition, and so cultivating a more healthy way of living. So the word taken in isolation, if one thinks of these as isolated moments, it's probably not very effective. But I think the way to think of these is regular conversations and as markers of much more enduring relationships. One doesn't just go to one's Abba or elder one time, one goes frequently. And in Cassian, this is emphasized. One should constantly be in conversation with one's elders, so that what one finds, on Monday, you go back on Tuesday, on a Wednesday, maybe even more often, to really be thinking through your experiences, and to have the opportunity regularly to have those interpreted and your own way of thinking kind of altered by these words. And so the word is part of a longer relationship of confession, direction, submission, and advice.
Thank you. Another participant has asked if you found anything in your research about setting right boundaries in spiritual direction, and regarding the proneness to abuse of authority of directors.
Yeah, that's another good question, and this comes, I think, to the implications raised by Wendy. There is a proneness to abuse. Cassian, again, is very explicit about this. He will say, there are some men who have the reputation but not the character of an elder, and they'll hand out advice and they will abuse monks verbally, emotionally, but they are not true elders. And so he, in his texts, is trying to provide boundaries for people who would go into abuse. And so he's trying to say, all right, one way that you do this is by living within a larger community. It's not just one-on-one. It's always a relationship, yes, but within a larger community with other elders, with other authorities. And not just the authorities that are living in the community, but the authorities that are mediated through texts, like Cassian's works. One reason he includes all those stories of the famous Abbas of the desert, right? They function as exemplars and as restrainers of the more abusive tendencies. So you have that, you have other collections of sayings, which are all kind of functioning as curbs or guardrails on this. Now, that being said, there is an emphasis on the authority and on the necessity of absolute submission to that authority. And so in someone like Climacus, I mean, you do have to rely on the good character and discernment of the spiritual director, which is why he devotes so much time to trying to form the good character and discernment of the spiritual director so that they will live that way. In the end, you always have to rely on people, and you always have to have trust within relationships. These texts are providing some of the criteria by which trust can be earned and maintained, and also some of the signs and indications that maybe one's own relationship with the spiritual director isn't living up to that ideal, and maybe that should be changed. I think if it's okay if I just go on for another second or two, this comes back to something, Wendy, you also raised about this being the locus of these texts is the enclosed community of a monastery, usually a Cenobitic monastery, or at least a small group like that is a lifelong commitment, that is a kind of total way of life. What happens? How do you take it beyond those walls? And I think the way it gets beyond those walls, or one way it gets beyond those walls, is through these texts themselves. These become ways of making that way of life portable, not just because it's less about the locus as a walled space than about making the habits and qualities of life in that space possible in, say, an urban environment or in a familial setting rather than a specifically monastic one. And this happens especially with Climacus and the latter, which becomes mandatory reading during Lent for all Christians of the Eastern Roman Empire and now the Eastern Orthodox churches. And so it becomes more portable that way. And that might be one way to think of these as moving beyond the walled communities, making the practices of spiritual direction bigger than the classic locus of spiritual direction.
Great. I think we have time for two more questions. So the next question is, were there insights that you couldn't fit into the book or rabbit holes that you didn't have the chance to go down that will either be your next projects or projects that you would recommend for participants here in the workshop?
Yes, so many of those. But I'm gonna keep it to one, I think, which is lists. My colleagues here are sick of it, but I love lists. Lists are how we fashion our lives. They're amazing. And so looking at Cassian's lists, Evagrius's, Climacus's, has put me into mind of thinking about how lists are used to organize emotion. And this is putting me in touch with work that I would recommend, which is, well, apart from the work that's already come out from those on the panel and others, I know Andrew is engaged in more work on the history of emotions in early Christianity. And I think that's a really exciting direction that this began to take me in, which I hope to pursue, and I hope we all have some time to pursue, which is the historical contingency of emotions as these open up the thought world of early Christianity later, as well as everything else, really. But for me, that's going to be taking place through the construction, deployment, and modulation of lists in Byzantine literature. So, yeah.
Fantastic. And it is 2:29. So the very last question is, how long does the discount code last? Which I have just put in the chat again, for those of you who missed it at the front of the webinar.
Well, I'll say the discount lasts as long as indefinitely. It doesn't go away. I don't know how long OUP will be in business or that sort of thing, or how long the climate crisis really gives us. So there's probably an upward limit on it, but yeah. I did want to acknowledge there was a question from Richard Armstrong, who was very much my mentor at the University of Houston for 6 years, and to whom this book was dedicated. He asked if there's a place for resistance on the part of the patient, and not as much as in psychoanalysis, but this is one of the great questions, I think, of how to apply spiritual direction as a model for wider therapeutic care. Now, what is the role of the patient as opposed to the role of the director? So I think that's a great question to kind of continue with.
Yes, there's a couple more questions that are in the queue, but we don't have time for. So some of them have names on them, and Jonathan can reply to you directly. If you submitted your question anonymously, I've just put Jonathan's email address in the chat. So please do reach out to him. He's happy to answer your questions after the webinar. So in closing, it is 2:30. We want to respect your time. Many thanks to our respondents for their prepared remarks, to our participants, especially those who offered comments and questions, and most especially our gratitude and hearty congratulations to our friend Jonathan Zecher on the publication of this marvelous book. Again, if you haven't purchased it yet, now's the time, and also reach out to your institutions to purchase for their libraries as well. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.